When Denzel Washington walked into Donald Trump's rally without an invitation, no one expected the room to fall silent. No one thought a single minute of quiet words would make headlines, or that a crowd divided by politics would pause to listen. But that night in Dallas, something unscripted happened between a president used to control and an actor who refused to stay silent. This is how it unfolded. "This is a Trump rally. Go back to Hollywood." The voice came from somewhere near the front, a man in a red cap, leaning forward with both hands cupped around his mouth like he needed the extra volume. Phones shot into the air before Denzel had even taken another step. He didn't react. He just kept moving, slow, measured, like he was crossing a threshold he'd already decided he could not ignore. Trump paused mid-sentence, the practiced rhythm of his voice snagging on the sight of Denzel Washington walking alone down the side aisle. He narrowed his eyes and tilted his head, as if he were trying to decide whether this was some kind of prank. The crowd rustled, a shiver of confusion and anticipation moving from the first rows to the cheap seats in the back. A woman whispered to her husband, "Is that really him?" "It can't be," but it was. The way he moved, the way his shoulders settled, no one could imitate that. No entourage, no press badge dangling from a lanyard. Just a dark jacket, dark jeans, and that expression he'd worn in half a dozen films when the script called for a man who knew the cost of his own choices. Trump leaned forward into the microphone, voice dripping with disbelief. "I thought you liked Law and Order, Denzel. Guess not." A few chuckles rippled across the room, but they sounded thin, brittle. Denzel didn't stop. He passed a cluster of folding chairs marked press and walked within 10 feet of the stage. Some people lifted their phones higher, hoping to catch every second. Others turned away, arms crossed tight, as if pretending he wasn't there would make the moment disappear. Near the center aisle, a man in a veteran's cap stood up slowly. His back was stiff, movements careful, like he carried pain in every joint. He didn't say anything, didn't wave his arms or try to hush the crowd. He just stood there, head high, looking at Denzel with something closer to recognition than surprise. Years earlier, this same veteran had watched Denzel host a fundraiser for families who'd lost sons and daughters in combat. That memory did not care about party lines. Trump shifted his weight, gripping the podium like he was steadying himself. He tried for humor, the edge creeping back into his tone. "What, you here to give me an acting lesson?" The laughter this time was louder, but it came from a narrower slice of the room. A woman in a blue sweater, sitting near the veterans section, lifted her phone and started recording. Her hands shook just slightly, but she kept going. The man beside her muttered, "Don't encourage him." She ignored it. Denzel came to a stop a few paces from the steps leading to the stage. He looked up, meeting Trump's gaze without blinking. The lights were bright on his face, washing out the color of his jacket, but not the steady, almost tired calm in his expression. Someone behind him shouted, "You're not welcome here." The words slapped the air, sharp and immediate. For a moment it looked like security might surge forward. Two men in black suits shifted, radios pressed to their collars. One took a step toward Denzel, then hesitated. Trump exhaled, loud enough for the mic to catch it. His eyes tracked the security detail, then flicked back to Denzel. He smirked, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Thought you'd just stroll in and make this your scene, huh?" Denzel didn't answer. He stood there, hands at his sides, like he'd decided that silence could say enough for now. In the second row, the veteran lifted one hand, palm up, not waving, just showing it, like he was testifying. Like he wanted it on record that he saw something worth hearing. Trump noticed, his gaze flicking to the raised hand, then back to the man in front of him. Some in the crowd shifted in their seats, restless, unsure which way to lean. A woman near the aisle adjusted her grip on her flag, the pole tapping lightly against her knee. Another voice, softer this time, asked, "What's he even doing here?" Denzel lifted his chin. He scanned the room, meeting eyes when he could. He did not look hurried. He did not look afraid. The man who had played heroes, rebels, soldiers, and sinners was just standing there as himself, unannounced, uninvited, and unwilling to pretend he hadn't come for a reason. Trump's hand hovered over the microphone controls like he was considering cutting the audio altogether. Then he leaned forward again, voice low, not quite amused anymore. "I thought you liked Law and Order, Denzel. Guess not." The words echoed a second time, heavier now, as if even the repetition could not settle the question of why a man like that had walked into this room alone. Trump did not take his eyes off Denzel as he lifted a hand and made a small circling motion to the security detail standing off stage. It was not an order barked through the microphone. It was quieter, more deliberate, as if he wanted the cameras to capture how little he needed to raise his voice to get things moving. The two agents in dark suits shifted again, stepping into the aisle. One reached for the radio at his shoulder. Denzel did not move. He didn't look at the guards closing in. He kept his gaze locked on Trump, the weight of that stare heavier than any outburst. He lifted one hand, palm out, not in protest, but in a gesture so calm it almost slowed the air itself. "Give me 60 seconds, then I'll leave." The words came out even, carried through the mic without strain. For a heartbeat, no one reacted. The people in the first rows glanced from Trump to the security team to the man standing alone under the hot lights. Trump let out a sharp breath, the sound spiking through the speakers. 60 seconds, he repeated, voice scraping against disbelief. "That's what your team rehearsed?" A thin, nervous laughter flickered across a pocket of the crowd, but it didn't catch. The man in the veteran's cap stayed standing, hand still raised like it was anchoring the room to something more honest. Behind the press barrier, a reporter leaned closer to her colleague, voice pitched low so only their corner could hear. "He's been talking about this since the NAACP speech last week. Said he was tired of waiting for an invitation that would never come." Trump tilted his head to the side, studying Denzel as if trying to decipher what he thought he was accomplishing. He lifted one brow, that familiar look he wore when he wanted to remind the audience that he always had the upper hand. "You think you can walk in here, all your movie awards, all your lectures, and grab the spotlight? You think this is your show now?" No one laughed that time. The crowd had gone quieter, like something brittle was settling into the atmosphere. The two security agents stopped about 10 feet away from Denzel. Neither looked eager to be the first to move. One shifted his weight, glancing back at the stage, waiting for the final signal. Denzel turned just enough to see them, but did not step back. His voice, when it came again, stayed low and steady. "I'm not here for a show. I'm not here to fight. I'm here to say something before we forget how to listen." A woman in the middle rows lowered her phone. For a second, her eyes met his. She did not smile, did not nod. But she did not look away. Trump pressed both hands flat against the podium, leaning forward so the microphone caught every syllable. "Let me explain how this works," he said, the softness in his tone more menacing than a shout. "When people want to make speeches at my rallies, they do it the right way. They don't sneak in, they don't wait until the cameras are rolling." Denzel did not answer. He just stood there, and the pause stretched out, long enough that the crowd could feel it pressing against their chests. The veteran in the second row shifted his weight, as if bracing for whatever came next. Trump straightened, his face settling into a look halfway between irritation and calculation. He pointed one finger at Denzel, then let his hand drop back to the edge of the podium. 60 seconds, he repeated, almost as if tasting the phrase. "That's not how it works." Someone from the back called out, "Just let him say his piece." Another voice added, "What are you afraid of?" The agents did not move. They were waiting for the final command, for a nod or a wave that would end the standoff. Denzel lifted his chin, not defiant, just steady. He had walked into the room knowing exactly what it would cost him to stand there without an invitation. He had not brought a prepared speech, only the conviction that staying silent was no longer an option. For a moment, it was as if the building itself was holding its breath, the ceiling lights humming over the silence. No slogans, no applause, just the slow realization that something unscripted was happening, something neither side could spin away. Trump shifted again, his mouth tightening into a line. He looked at the veteran still standing, then back at Denzel. 60 seconds, he said, but this time the words were softer, almost like a dare. "Let's hear it." The veteran's voice cut through the uneasy hush with a steadiness that made every head turn. "He helped my family after my brother didn't come home. Let him speak." His words did not carry the heat of anger. They sounded more like a quiet obligation, a memory surfacing at the worst possible time and refusing to be buried. For a moment, no one moved. A dozen cameras swung to catch the sight of this older man in a faded cap, hand still lifted. The silence cracked just enough for another person to rise. a woman near the aisle with a white blouse and tired eyes. She didn't say anything, only stood and folded her arms across her chest, like she needed something to hold onto. A third person followed, then a fourth. The sound that rose next was not loud. It started as a few hesitant claps, out of sync, unsure, as if people were testing whether it was safe to show any kind of approval. Trump shifted his weight behind the podium. He watched the pockets of the crowd begin to organize themselves without his permission. A muscle in his jaw worked, his gaze moving from the veteran to the security team still hovering, to Denzel standing so still you might have thought he was carved there. "You see this circus?" he snapped, not bothering to lower his voice this time. Cameras whirred and clicked, eager for every word. "You see this? You think this is about courage, about respect? It's not, it's theater. That's all it ever is with these people." The woman who had stood in silence looked down, her hands tightening around her elbows. But she did not sit back down. Denzel didn't move. He didn't flinch when Trump's voice rose. He didn't look away when the word theater was spit like an accusation. Instead, he waited, eyes clear, as if he was willing to stand there all night if that's what it took for the room to decide what it believed. A man in a checkered shirt, somewhere in the middle rows, called out, "Just let him say it. You said you weren't afraid of debate." Trump pressed his palms flat against the podium again. "Fine," he said, the word bitten off, a fragment of something sharper he decided not to finish. "Fine, 60 seconds, then he's out." He stepped back, crossing his arms over his chest. He did not look at Denzel as he moved. He looked out over the crowd, his mouth pulled tight, as if daring anyone else to speak. A low murmur passed through the hall. You could feel the phones coming up, dozens of tiny lenses blinking red in the darkness. You could feel the collective intake of breath, 100 hearts beating faster because something unscripted was happening and no one could predict what would come next. The security agents did not step aside, but they did not advance either. One of them glanced at the veteran still standing, at the lines in his face that looked carved there by years of waiting for the respect that never arrived on schedule. Denzel took a small step forward. Not enough to mount the stairs, not enough to claim the stage. Just enough to show he had heard the permission, reluctant as it was. In the corner near the press riser, a young woman lifted her phone to her ear, whispering a rushed update to someone on the other end. Her voice was shaking. "Yes," she said, "he's actually here." No, no one stopped him. It's happening right now. Trump did not uncross his arms. His expression had settled into something that looked almost bored, except for the tight line at the corner of his mouth that betrayed how closely he was watching every reaction. The applause, if you could call it that, never became a roar. It stayed thin, nervous, the kind of sound people make when they are afraid of being the first or the last to clap. But it was enough. Enough to say this moment had crossed some invisible line between performance and something people might remember for reasons they didn't fully understand yet. A man near the wall lowered his phone and rubbed his jaw, like he was trying to decide what side of the line he stood on. A woman farther back whispered, "This is going to be everywhere." Denzel didn't look at the cameras. He didn't look at Trump. He looked at the veteran who had spoken first and nodded once, slow and deliberate, like a promise had been made between them. Then he turned to face the rows of folding chairs, the faces lit by screens and expectation. His hands stayed at his sides, open, empty, not reaching for a microphone he hadn't been offered. No one told the room to be quiet, but it happened anyway. The hush gathered in the corners, pressing down until every cough, every breath seemed too loud. Trump drew in a long, audible breath and let it out slow, as if he could exhale the power this moment had stolen. 60 seconds, he said again, his voice lower, edged with something close to resignation. "Make it count." Denzel did not take the steps to the stage. He stayed on the floor, the light spilling across him in a way that left his shadow stretching long and uneven against the first row of chairs. He took a breath, slow and steady, and for the first time since he walked in, he let himself look around, really look. His eyes moved from face to face, past the raised phones, the folded arms, the hands gripping flags too tightly. He did not rush, he did not pretend he had all the answers. When he spoke, his voice was softer than anyone expected. "I played Malcolm X once. People thought I understood courage because of that role." He paused just long enough for the memory to slip into the air, heavier than any slogan. But tonight, I'm just Denzel, a man who grew up sweeping a barber shop in New York, a man who believed listening still mattered. Someone near the aisle let out a breath that sounded almost like relief. Another person shifted in their seat, blinking fast, as if trying to decide whether to look down or meet his gaze. Denzel lifted his chin, and his voice carried a little farther, but it never rose. If hearing a different voice makes you feel like you're losing your country, maybe you already did. No one interrupted. No one moved. The hush settled deeper, as though every person was afraid that even the smallest sound might shatter something fragile they hadn't realized they were holding. He glanced at the veteran in the second row, the man whose hand had come up first, and nodded, a small acknowledgement that he had not come here to steal the spotlight, but to repay something he could not name. "I'm not here to pretend I have the solution to everything that keeps us up at night," he continued, his hands still at his sides, fingers loose. "I'm not here because I think standing here makes me better or braver than anyone in this room. I'm here because I got tired of waiting for an invitation to be part of the conversation." He let that sit a moment. A few people shifted again, but no one spoke. "When I was a kid, my mother used to tell me that you don't really know who you are until you see how you act when nobody agrees with you," he said. "And you don't really know what you believe until you can say it without shouting." Trump did not move behind the podium. His arms stayed folded, but his eyes were locked on Denzel, watching every word as though cataloging them for some later reckoning. "I know some of you think I came here to make a scene," Denzel said, his tone unhurried. "Maybe some of you think I'm just another Hollywood voice telling you how to feel about your own life." He shook his head, almost imperceptibly. "That's not why I'm standing here." He turned slightly, letting his gaze pass over the faces that were closest to him. Some looked away. Some stared back, wary but unable to disengage. "I came because I believe this country is worth more than the loudest voices," he said. "I came because I don't think courage belongs to any one party or any one kind of American." Someone in the middle rows let their phone drop into their lap. The small thump of plastic on denim was louder than it should have been. Denzel did not flinch. "I came because when a place gets so divided that the idea of listening feels like surrender, we all lose something we can't get back." He paused again. The pause did not feel empty. It felt necessary, like he was giving the room a chance to keep up. A few seats over, a man in a plaid shirt leaned forward, elbows braced on his knees. His lips parted, but no words came out. Denzel took another breath. "I know what it is to be afraid that if you let someone else speak, it means you're giving something up. I know what it is to think silence is safer. But I didn't come here to be safe." He looked down at his hands, turning one palm up as though he was remembering something only he could see. "I came because somewhere along the way, we started believing that disagreement was the same thing as disrespect," he said, his voice dropping just enough that the microphone almost didn't catch it. "And I don't believe that. I won't believe that." He let his hand fall back to his side. "If this is what losing looks like," he said quietly, "then maybe we were never winning at all." Nobody stirred. Even the restless shifting had stopped. He scanned the rows one more time. His gaze never settled on the cameras. It stayed on the faces. The tired ones, the angry ones, the ones who did not know what they were feeling yet. "I don't need you to agree with me," he said. "I don't need you to applaud. I just need you to remember that listening does not make you weak." Trump's jaw tensed. For a heartbeat, it looked as though he might cut the microphone, reclaim the moment, reassert the hierarchy everyone expected. But he did not move. Denzel exhaled, and it sounded almost like the end of something he had been carrying for longer than he cared to admit. "That's all I came to say." He did not step back. He did not lower his eyes. He stood there steady, while the silence gathered and grew, wrapping around the room until it felt like no one dared to speak for fear of breaking it. Denzel lowered his head, just a fraction, like he was acknowledging something no one else could see. "That's all," he said, his voice low enough that for a second it seemed possible the microphone might miss it. But it didn't. Every syllable landed in the hush that had wrapped itself around the room. He turned, slow, unhurried, as if there were no reason to rush through this ending. As he started back down the aisle, the silence held. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't even confused anymore. It was something heavier, something that pressed into the ribs and made breathing feel like an effort. He passed the first row, where the veteran still stood, hand lowered now but eyes locked on him. Denzel met that gaze for a moment and nodded again, the same small gesture that had started all of this. A little boy, maybe 8 or 9, perched on the edge of a folding chair, a red cap pulled low over his forehead. He watched Denzel with a solemnity too big for his age. Just as Denzel moved past, the boy lifted his hand and gave a small wave, uncertain but determined. Denzel stopped. He didn't turn all the way back. He just paused, long enough that every eye in the room followed the tiny motion. Slowly, he reached out and set his palm on the back of an empty chair beside the boy, as if steadying himself against a memory. Then he let his hand drop and kept walking. No one spoke. No one shouted. The cameras kept rolling, but even the people behind the lenses seemed to understand that narrating would cheapen whatever this was. Near the back wall, a man in a denim jacket shifted, then brought his hands together in a single, uncertain clap. The sound cracked the quiet like a pebble dropped in water. It faded almost as quickly as it started, but it was enough. Another clap followed, softer, from the far left corner. Then another, somewhere behind the press riser. Each one separated by seconds that felt longer than they were. Denzel did not look back. His steps stayed measured, his shoulders neither slumped nor stiff. He passed the last row and reached the point where the aisle opened into the side hallway, the light there dimmer, softer. Trump remained behind the podium, arms still crossed, his mouth a flat line. He did not say anything. He did not try to reclaim the attention he had ceded, perhaps only by accident, perhaps because even he knew no words could put the moment back in the box it had escaped. The clapping never became applause. It stayed scattered, uncertain, like people were trying to figure out if it was allowed, if it meant they were betraying something they believed. A woman near the center pressed her hand over her mouth, eyes fixed on the spot where Denzel had stood. Her shoulders lifted with a quiet breath she seemed afraid to release. One of the security agents stepped aside, giving Denzel a little more room to pass, though no one had told him to do it. Somewhere near the exit, a phone buzzed, loud in the hush. No one reached for it. Denzel crossed the threshold into the hall without pausing again. The dim light caught the edge of his face, the line of his jaw. He did not look back to see who was watching or who was not. Trump exhaled, a sound that carried through the microphone, though he hadn't meant it to. He shifted his weight like he was about to speak, but found nothing to say. The hush held a few moments longer, like the room itself was reluctant to break whatever fragile thing had been laid across it. Then the boy in the red cap lowered his hand and turned to look at his father, who did not meet his eyes. The folding chairs creaked as people shifted, as if waking up from a long pause they hadn't agreed to take. And still, no one filled the silence with words. It did not feel like victory or defeat. It felt like something truer, something that would follow them out of the building and into whatever came next. The moment Denzel disappeared into the hallway, the phones came up in a rush. It was like a dam broke. Screens glowed everywhere, shaky video feeds shooting to friends and followers. No one wanted to be the last to share it. No one wanted to be the only person who could not say they saw it live. Before the folding chairs had fully emptied, clips were already moving across social media. Low-resolution fragments of a man standing perfectly still under the lights, a voice that never rose above measured. In one video, the boy with the red cap could be seen raising his hand. That tiny gesture became the image of the night, a still frame that felt like it carried too much meaning to unpack in a caption. Fox News interrupted their programming with a breaking banner that ran in all caps. Denzel hijacks Trump rally, Democrats cheer. The anchor's voice had that particular mixture of outrage and fascination that always meant ratings would spike. On another channel, a host tried to figure out how to describe what had happened without admitting it felt bigger than politics. CNN aired the same footage on a loop, the crawl at the bottom of the screen reading, "Unscripted moment leaves Trump silent." In the back halls of the convention center, Trump paced in a tight line. He still held the microphone in one hand, even though it had been switched off. A staffer trailed behind, talking into a headset, voice cracking with urgency as she repeated the same sentence over and over. "Yes, sir, we're drafting a statement." "No, sir, we don't recommend ignoring it." Trump didn't look at her. He threw the microphone onto a folding table where it skidded and clattered to the floor. A plastic water bottle went next, smacking the wall and bouncing under a chair. "I don't care if he's an Oscar winner," he said, voice ragged with something that sounded too raw to be called anger alone. This was sabotage. The staffer hesitated, the headset slipping down around her neck. She did not answer because there was nothing safe to say. Half a mile away, in a quiet car parked behind the venue, a major donor was already on the phone with his accountant. He spoke in clipped, careful words. "I want that check held. 1 million, put it on pause until I see how this plays out." On Twitter, a conservative columnist posted a single sentence above the video. "When the man who played Malcolm X sounds calmer than our leaders, you know the country's tired." The comment was liked and shared so quickly it broke through the usual echo chambers, carried by people who did not usually repost anything political. A woman in Ohio wrote under the clip, "I don't even like Denzel Washington," but that was something real. A man in Arizona commented, "You know how sick we are of yelling? This." In a quiet corner of the press riser, a junior producer replayed her own footage for the 4th time. Each time she watched, she felt the same thing rising in her chest, something she didn't have a name for yet. Trump finally stopped pacing. He planted both hands on the edge of the table and leaned forward, his breath coming heavy. "Get me Wesley," he snapped. The aide nodded, moving quickly to the far side of the room. Wesley Stokes entered a minute later, still typing something on his phone. He did not look up right away. When he did, his expression was careful, neutral, the way it always was when he knew the news was bad. "We need to get ahead of this," he said, voice low. "It's moving too fast." Trump lifted his head slowly. "Ahead of what?" "A man walks in, says nothing special, and everyone treats it like he just saved America." Wesley waited a beat before answering. "He didn't yell," he said. "He didn't insult you. That's why it worked." The silence that followed was taut, pulled so tight it felt like something would snap. Outside, the crowd had thinned, but no one was really leaving. They stood in clusters near the exits, rewatching the clip on their phones, each person trying to make sense of why it felt like something shifted in them, even if they didn't want to admit it. Reporters recorded quick stand-ups under the marquee lights. Some tried to frame it as a publicity stunt. Others couldn't help letting a note of wonder slip into their voices. A producer for a right-leaning radio network shook his head as he packed up his gear. "You can't coach that kind of composure," he muttered. In the holding area, Trump gripped the table harder. "That man came here to humiliate me," he said. "Don't pretend otherwise." Wesley studied him without blinking. "Maybe," he said finally, "or maybe he just came to remind people they still have a choice to listen." Trump's eyes flicked up, cold and narrow. "I want every network to know this was a setup. Every one of them." The aide with the headset cleared her throat. "Sir, we already put out a preliminary statement. We called it a staged disruption." "Good," Trump said, straightening. "Because if we let this narrative harden, it's going to cost us more than applause." A phone buzzed on the table. Wesley picked it up, scanning the screen. "PBS wants an interview with him, and someone at Fox, too." Trump laughed once, a short, humorless sound. "Let them. He'll take the bait and overplay his hand. That's what they always do." But his jaw stayed clenched long after Wesley looked away. The truth was, the room had never fully come back to him. Not when Denzel turned, not when the last claps faded, not even when he tried to fill the space with something louder. Outside, someone replayed the clip again, the grainy audio cutting through the night air. "That's all," Denzel's voice said, just before he stepped away. For hours afterward, it felt like nobody really knew what to say. The next morning, Denzel sat alone in a narrow cafe tucked between a pawn shop and a boarded-up grocery in Oak Cliff. The place smelled like burnt espresso and old linoleum. It was early enough that only a few tables were occupied, mostly older men reading folded newspapers, a woman in scrubs with a to-go cup balanced on her knee. He kept his head down over the chipped mug between his palms, as if he could will the heat back into the coffee that had already gone lukewarm. Every so often, he checked his phone, but the notifications were still coming faster than he could swipe them away. A television hung in the corner over the pastry case, the volume turned low. The headline looping across the screen read, 60 seconds that shook a room and maybe more. Footage of the rally played again, grainy and too bright, showing him standing alone, hands open at his sides. The captions labeled him actor, activist, intruder, depending on which station was speaking. He looked away, back to his coffee. He had known there would be fallout. He had not known it would feel so hollow to watch himself turned into a segment between commercials. The bell over the door jingled. He didn't glance up until he felt a shadow cross his table. When he did, he saw the woman in scrubs standing there, holding something small in her hand. She looked nervous, but determined not to turn around. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice catching a little. "I don't mean to bother you." "You're not," he said, and he meant it. She took a breath. "My dad's voted red all his life," she said, almost apologetic. "He watched your clip 3 times last night. He asked me to give you this." She set the folded piece of paper on the edge of the table. Then she stepped back, as if giving him space to decide what to do with it. Denzel looked at the note for a moment before picking it up. The handwriting was careful, the letters etched in block print like the writer had not wanted to risk being misunderstood. "I don't agree with you, but I listened." He closed his eyes for a moment, the paper warm from her hand. When he opened them again, she was still standing there, waiting. "That's more than I expected," he said quietly. She smiled, a small, tired thing, then nodded and walked back to her table. He sat still, the note resting against his palm. On the TV, a panel of commentators argued over whether his appearance had been a stunt or something more sincere. The volume stayed low, but every few seconds he caught his own name over the hum of the espresso machine. He thought about the boy in the red cap, about the veteran whose voice had steadied the room, about all the faces he had met only for a moment but felt like he would remember longer than any camera would keep the footage alive. Someone behind the counter turned up the television, just enough that the anchor's voice carried over the tables. The clip rolled again, the same words repeated in captions. That's all he heard himself say. The espresso machine hissed. A man at the window lifted his phone and took a photo without asking. Denzel did not look up to meet his eyes. He could feel the shape of the moment growing in ways he hadn't intended. Requests for interviews, offers to write op-eds, invitations to debates. It all felt like noise that threatened to drown out the small truth he had come to say. He finished his coffee and left a few bills folded under the cup. As he stood, the woman in scrubs lifted her hand in a shy wave. He returned it with a nod, no words. Outside, the morning was bright and unseasonably cool. He pulled his collar up against the wind. For a few seconds, he stood on the cracked sidewalk, just breathing, letting the noise of traffic and birdsong push back the echo of his own voice on every screen. He did not think about what would happen next. He did not think about whether the clip would fade by tomorrow or be played 100 more times. He walked down the block, past the empty grocery, past the row of shuttered storefronts. He kept moving because that was the only thing that felt honest. He had not stood in that hall to become a moment. He had not raised his hand to be a headline. He had done it because listening was the one thing he still believed could matter, even when everything else felt too divided to hold. Somewhere behind him, the cafe door swung shut. The bell jangled against the glass, and for a moment it almost sounded like applause.